Great to be here in person to meet family, friends and former colleagues of Simon. So as you know, this is the second Simon Brooke Lecture. Last year we looked at the topic of international exchange when it comes to housing policy. This year we're looking at the intersection between domestic violence and housing in Ireland. So both really important topics which we think Simon would have been very interested in, and I suppose that's the point of these lectures, to come together to celebrate his memory, to celebrate his work and his legacy. So just a few housekeeping bits and pieces. So there's toilets at the back. We'll also be having refreshments back that direction at the end. So please, feel free to stay for them. We'd love to have people stick around. You'll have received the programme there on your seats. So where we've listed the excellent speakers that we have today. So we have Anna Yusuf, Simon's wife, plus many other roles. Dr. Paula Mayak, Sarah Kennedy. Claire Feeney was due to join us. Unfortunately, she's sick this evening. Lisa Marmion and Aoife Flynn Kennedy. And so we'll be giving you more details on those speakers later, and there's details in the programme as well. There's also a nice Cornerstone publication just on the tables there behind you. So Cornerstone was a publication from the Housing Agency, which covered topics relating to housing policy in Ireland, and they produced a really nice edition in memory of Simon last year. So it really kind of gives you an insight into the type of man he was, for those of you who don't know. So take a look at that. And there's also some lovely memorial bookmarks that Anna had put together, just scattered around the tables there. If you'd like to take one of those to kind of, I suppose, celebrate one of Simon's great loves, which was books. So feel free to peruse them. So just note the presence of a videographer, who I'm sure you've noticed, and a photographer. So if you would prefer not to be photographed or videoed, just let one of us know, and we'll make sure to cut you out or have you not filmed or photographed. Just to say, there's an opportunity for the audience to engage in a Q&A at the end of the panel discussion later in the evening. So hold your thoughts. So yeah, without further ado, I'll introduce you to Brian O'Gorman, CEO of Clúid, to say a few words. Thanks very much, Brian.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the second Simon Brooke Lecture. While I'm always happy to celebrate, as Simon indeed was, it's also important to remember those who've helped to bring us to where we are and acknowledge such as Simon, whose contribution helped us to get to exactly where we are. This is not to be straitjacketed by the past, but to understand how we got here to better move ahead. I'm delighted, as Fiona has said already, to participate in this event, and especially to meet in person. Each year, the Simon Brooke Lecture has a different policy focus. This year's topic is the intersection between domestic violence and housing, and how we can improve access to housing and understand the experience of housing for survivors of domestic violence. I've been involved in research in one way or another most of my working life. What I value most about Clúid's undertaking research work is that it is informed by our day-to-day activity. Our research is not arid and speculative, but it is influenced by what we encounter. The research, I believe, carries authenticity because it is from an organisation who is involved in the issues it is researching. This is a strong position to be in, so long as we are open-minded and accept that our experience needs the rigour of independent research, and until then our impressions are just that, our experiences. Today's topic was discussed by and chosen by the Policy Ambassadors Group. This is a group of staff. The discussion occurred around the time of the discussion, or the choice of this topic occurred around the time those tragic events surrounding the death of Aisling Murphy. The Policy Ambassadors Group is made up of staff within Clúid from all parts of the organisation and is facilitated by Fiona Duncan, who leads policy in Clúid. The group exists to help staff become informed about the policies that underpin Clúid's operations. Another important aspect of policy is to recognise its therapeutic value. Work, particularly the work we're involved in, can often become difficult. particularly when encountering the same issues again and again. The same issues that frustrate our residents, frustrate staff who are working with them. The context, which is provided by policy work and seeing the bigger picture, does help you through. I do hope you all enjoy this evening. And now I'd like to introduce Simon's wife, Anna Hussaf. In the 1980s, Anna worked with homeless people in England and was later on the board of the Dublin Simon for a number of years. She spent many years working on radio and TV programmes in RTE before becoming a novelist, writing mainly in her first language, Irish. Anna.
Thanks so much, Brian. Agus gur míle maith, and now I'll continue in Simon's first language. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us here this evening. It's emotional for me, obviously, and it's emotional for me, especially to meet people I haven't met since Simon's funeral 2.5 years ago. He would have been hugely honoured that this was taking place and amazed. And he would also have been really, really pleased that it's an opportunity for policy discussion, because that was what he always wanted to advance. And implementation, of course. What I'd like to do, though, is to give a brief flavour of some of the values and personal traits that he brought to his work and to his life as a kind of context for the event, for people, whether you knew Simon well or not at all. His fundamental belief was in the equality of every human being and in backing that equality with legally enforceable rights that would give everyone the opportunity of a good life, economically, socially, culturally, sustainably, a life in which the daily pain and humiliations of poverty and the obscenities of piling vast wealth are ended, and similarly hatred, violence and power games between individuals, groups and countries. An impossible ask, we might well say, but striving for a better world in whatever small or larger ways we can means not giving in to the worst of it. And change for the better does happen from time to time, as we can see in so many instances around us here. In the late 1970s, when Simon started his first job with a housing NGO in London, issues of diversity and what we now call identity politics were coming to the fore. Among his 7 or 8 colleagues, Simon realised, a little to his dismay, that he was on the wrong side of the equality tables. He was male, white, heterosexual, middle class, and in full bodily health. And he was the only person on the team ticking all those boxes. But then he realised, well, I'm a man of small stature, 5'3" in good shoes. So what a relief, phew, I had my very own oppression of sizeism to myself. Both of us took seriously the maxim that the personal is political. So the politics of getting married had to be gone through, and when we did, naturally we both kept our own surname. Then when I was pregnant, questions of equality had to be considered in choosing the child's surname. We weren't keen on double barrels, so our solution was that if we had a girl, she'd have Simon's surname, and if we had a boy, he would have my surname, and thus our son is Paula Mayak. All very simple and equal, and it rather surprised us that this never became, or hasn't yet become, common practice, and that a lot of people still believe that legally a child has to have a married father's surname. But you can ask me afterwards what surname we would have given a second child if we'd had a second child. Back in his work life, Simon believed fervently in teamwork and collaboration, and among his pet hates were pomposity and the kind of big egos who are more interested in getting attention for themselves more than for the campaign or the project in hand. And obviously everybody in this room is excluded from that description. However, he did rather enjoy gossiping about such characters, as several people who are now laughing can attest, having joined in the same gossiping. And indeed, he found it essential to spend time hatching plans and tactics in cafes and pubs, as well as in a lifetime of meetings and desk work. As was shown in the wonderful tribute edition of Cornerstone, Simon was hugely engaged with life and was very witty, irreverent and lots of fun to be with. At the same time, he was a very self-contained person and he loved and needed solitude. So every year or two when possible, he went, when it wasn't always possible, he went off somewhere like the Isle of Wight for days of walking, contented solitary walking. And his idea of a leisurely Sunday was hours of undisturbed reading or gardening or cooking while listening to mainly classical music. And luckily, I like some solitude too. He usually exuded enthusiasm and hope for whatever he was chipping away at in work. But a frequent comment of his on the state of the world was that it would make you despair sometimes, as indeed it would. On a lighter note though, at the age of 12 or so, our son Conall pointed out that Simon and I had always reacted to political news stories of the day in one of two modes. So if the news was bad, a new scandal, some dire decision, one of us was bound to say, "It's typical, isn't it? It's so typical of this country, of that minister, of whoever. How do we put up with it?" And if the news was good and an enlightened decision was announced, we'd just say, "Well, it's about time too." I won't talk about traits of Simon's, or my own, that were not so easy to live with, but I will say that the last thing he'd ever want would be to be put on a pedestal. Conall and I miss him every day, and I know that a lot of people here miss him a lot too. As well as putting his intellect, heart and soul into his housing work, he had loads of other interests and great friendships, and he'd hoped to give more time to all of those in his retirement that he didn't get. So instead, the best we can do is to remember the best of him. And I'm so grateful to everyone who instigated the Simon Brooke Lecture and Award. And I won't try saying who everybody is because you know it yourselves, but to Clúid for taking on the organisation of it, and to Fiona for organising this evening's event so well. And as Fiona said, for anybody who doesn't already have a few of these bookmarks, because there's still some of them in a box at home, or the Cornerstone magazine, do please feel free to take them. So, Gurmila Mahan, very much.
Thanks so much, Anna, for that kind of personal insight to Simon, and some aspects that we knew, some aspects that were a surprise. So really, thanks so much. And thanks to Anna as well for assisting in the organisation of this lecture today. So I'd like to now introduce our second speaker, who is Dr. Paula Mayak. Paula Mayak is Associate Professor with the School of Social Work and Social Policy in Trinity College Dublin, where Simon worked also. Her research focuses primarily on the lives and experiences of marginalised youth and adult populations, covering areas such as homelessness, drug use and drug problems. She recently led a really interesting research project funded and published by Focus Ireland and the Housing Agency, some of whom are with us today, so thanks so much for joining us, on the intersection between domestic violence and family homelessness in Ireland. So Paula, I'd like to invite you to the podium. Thanks very much.
So thank you, Fiona, for that introduction, and good evening, everybody. It's a real honour for me to be here. Thank you, Fiona, and everybody at Clúid Housing for inviting me to speak at this event tonight. It's fantastic to be part of celebrating Simon's life and work and his legacy, as you mentioned, Anna. And as I say, it's a huge privilege for me. I did know Simon as he was an adjunct professor at the School of Social Work and Social Policy. But actually I didn't meet him a whole lot there, because we go from our lectures to into an office, I was far more likely to meet Simon at events or at training, at a conference, a talk, etc. And Simon was always prepared to stand up and have a talk with you. I also, on a number of occasions, bumped into Simon on the South Circular Road there at the back of James's Hospital, as I would myself, on my way walking from Drimna into work. And like that again, always the chat and so on. So, for all of these reasons, and knowing a lot about Simon's work, as I say, a great privilege to be here tonight. I'm just going to come out of it actually, and I might just do this. So I'm going to start by saying just a few introductory comments on the problem and the social problem we call domestic violence, domestic abuse, and its prevalence. So this violence in the domestic or private sphere, it does more commonly affect women, which is not to say it doesn't affect men, but certainly women are far more likely to experience domestic abuse. And of course, coercive control is highly gendered, with women the victims and men almost exclusively the perpetrators. When we talk about prevalence, like many things, it's very difficult to measure, and probably the most robust study, certainly at a European level, was conducted in 2014 by the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights. And this study found, it was a massive sample, by the way, of 42,000 respondents, that 1 in 3 women had experienced physical or sexual violence since the age of 15, and more than 1 in 5 ever partnered women had experienced lifetime physical and or sexual intimate partner violence. Now, of course, we know that since the onset of COVID, that there has been a dramatic rise in the number of women and girls experiencing domestic abuse, described by the United Nations very early on, in fact, in the pandemic as the shadow pandemic. According to data published by Safe Ireland in 2021, the country, when the country was at the height of its second level 5 lockdown, more than 2,180 women and 602 children received support from a dedicated domestic violence service. And of course, this is likely an underestimate, because during these lockdowns it was exceedingly difficult for women to report events and to get service supports and so on. Domestic violence does lead to the loss of housing. Firstly, we know from research, I just can't get, okay. Sorry. We know from research that even the process of leaving an abusive relationship is complex, and this complexity is strongly connected to the coercion, power and control exerted over women by their abusive partner. And within this control and power, the threat of losing one's home is inherent to the abuses that women experience. For this reason, housing can be a crucial factor and a significant barrier to women leaving an abusive relationship. And following separation then from that abusive home and that abusive partner, women and their children will inevitably experience significant income loss, financial hardship and housing insecurity. There is evidence from the US, for example, that suggests that women who experience domestic violence are 4 times more likely to report housing instability than other women. Likewise, survey data from Australia examining the effects of domestic violence and abuse has found that almost half of the women surveyed in that particular research lived in temporary dwellings, such as the houses of friends, in women's shelters, in cars, in car parks, and parks indeed, after they left an abusive partner. So for women then who experience domestic violence, there isn't a clear path to housing instability. And in fact, for many, and this will come up later when I present some findings from the recent research that Fiona mentioned in the introduction, that in fact domestic abuse becomes a pathway to homelessness. We're also going to see that women who experience domestic violence confront very strong barriers to housing stability after they exit an abusive relationship. These can be related to housing issues around housing affordability, discrimination in the housing market, and discrimination also, and for marginalised women in particular, from labour markets. So access to affordable, sustainable housing for women and children impacted by domestic abuse is clearly fundamental to their ability to safely move on, to gain independence and to enjoy a fruitful and independent life. So it will come then as no surprise that there is a well-documented association between women's homelessness and domestic violence. There's plenty of evidence at a European level that a significant proportion of families who access homelessness services have experienced domestic violence. There is also evidence of this in the Irish context. And we know from data, our own data in Ireland, and from data published in the United States, North America, Australia and so on, that family homelessness is highly gendered, disproportionately experienced by households headed by a single female parent. We also are aware, and it has been talked about for some time, the rapid feminisation of homelessness, evident in Ireland and in other European countries. And in fact, in the Irish context, compared to our European, many of our European neighbours, women's homelessness has over the past 10 years been at a higher proportion relative to other countries in the European Union. I'd like to say a few things a bit more generally about women and housing. And it's one of the interesting features here is that discussion of women's particular relationship with housing is very absent in the literature. It's also very absent within policy discourses. It's also very absent, for example, in media discourses related on the housing crisis and the homelessness crisis. And this is despite the fact that housing has long since been recognised as one of a key vehicles through which gender relations are mediated and sustained. We know about the situations of single parents and the fact that they, in particular, experience significant disadvantage in terms of accessing and sustaining housing. This has been demonstrated in recently published research by Helen Russell and colleagues at the ESRI. This situation has been commented on by Barry 2020, and here Ursula Barry points out that in 2015, 3 times the proportion of single-parent households were affected by rising house costs than were households without children. Given that women manage most single-parent households, this reflects the gendered impact of the housing crisis that deeply damages the daily lives and security of women and children. So Barry here is pointing out that of course this distinction is recognised, the distinction between those women, the expenditure for all families, but particularly those women who are coping alone. So, as I said, there is an absence of this of discussion of gender and housing in and of itself. Of course, this same absence of discussion is present within when we talk about homelessness. Now, at this point, I want to share with you some of the findings from this piece of research that was funded by Focus Ireland and the Housing Agency. It looked at domestic violence and family homelessness And I'm just going to, there were two major phases to the study. One was interviews conducted with over 100 stakeholders across the housing, homelessness and domestic violence service sectors. And phase two focused then on women themselves and their children, or families themselves and their family heads of households who left their homes because of domestic abuse. We interviewed 17 parents, and I just want to give you a snapshot of some of the findings that help to bring, I think, some of the points that I've been raising, to life and to give a voice to these families. So here Leah, who is aged 40, described leaving home. She said, "I remember it just hitting me and thinking, where am I going to go? Where am I literally going to go?" And that was a very scary feeling, with two little children in the back of the car and trying to appear happy to him, and inside I was just broken. So many other women like Leah had been experiencing domestic abuse for a very considerable period of time before leaving. So the point of leaving was preceded by a crisis and presented a major crisis for women. More than half stayed with a family member, so they were in situations of hidden homelessness, very often for extended periods of time. They experienced numerous barriers of access to domestic violence shelter. There were capacity issues, but also not all women were aware. And in fact, migrant women and traveller women there were particular deficits in their knowledge and understanding of the availability of domestic violence services and supports. So essentially then, at the point of leaving the abusive relationship, for most of the women, there were no protective systems in place or present. And this left them without adequate financial support, and left them really largely having to seek solutions independently to what essentially was a major housing crisis, but also a major personal crisis surrounded by a great deal of trauma. Their accommodation journeys post-leaving were lengthy, and there were just incredible levels of instability, with the parents here, the women, reporting between 2 and 12 moves with their children post-leaving the relationship. 7 of the women had lived in 5 or more accommodation types since they first left their homes, and the remaining participants had experienced between 2 and 4 moves. The average number of moves was high at 4.5 for the sample, and 3 of the women had experienced at least one period of rough sleeping. Now, these are just 2 examples. Here, Annette was aged 43. It had been 3.5 years since she first left her home with her children. She had returned to her abusive partner for a period of 12 months. We see here, going from emergency, the home of family or friends, essentially hidden homelessness, emergency homeless hostel, family hub, supported temporary accommodation. So a very high level of instability for her children, obviously creating enormous problems related to accessing schooling and just literally feeling safe. Cassia then is a migrant woman. She arrived in Ireland from Eastern Europe during the 20s. You see here her accommodation is shorter. She had, at the time of interview, she was living in private rented accommodation with HAP support for a period of 3 months. But significantly, she had just 2 weeks before the interview, she had received notice to quit, placing her again at risk of a return to homelessness. So really what these cases strongly suggest is that their housing options post-leaving, the relationship were extremely limited. And these women's abilities to secure safe, affordable housing for themselves and their children were severely compromised. So the experience then of seeking housing. Well, for most, all started to look for housing immediately. women who, including those women who accessed domestic violence refuge accommodation, in fact, all were very clear that the moment they accessed that accommodation, that they were strongly encouraged to find rental accommodation, and where many did receive obviously help and assistance from staff in those services, and indeed in homelessness services. For all of these women, the private rental market was the only option available. And the conditions were extremely difficult, highly competitive market. They consistently told that they felt they were very far down the desirability list as prospective tenants. A further problem then was the limit on HAP, the monthly costs of available properties far exceeding HAP limits. Very many claimed, in fact, that they were constantly screened by landlords and screened out by landlords at the point of seeking private rented accommodation. And here are just two counts of that. So Ellen explained that getting HAP payments, people didn't want to write back. She wouldn't get a response. Anything that revolved around HAP, I never heard from them again. So she describes this as intimidating. And Tara, who's just 25, spoke about sending hundreds of emails, and if she got a response, they were asking for a work reference, which I obviously don't have. They don't say it directly. That's their way of sneakily asking, because they can't ask directly. That's their way of finding out whether you have HAP or not. So there were just multiple and constant reports of discrimination within the private rental market. So the key challenges then, obviously difficulty accessing refuge accommodation, very strong barriers to housing access, high levels of transience, the inadequacy of HAP, which essentially locked them out of the private rental sector. I haven't gone into it here, but there was a lack of coordination, women having to constantly tell and retell their stories to multiple service providers, and a lot of them also reported a fundamental lack of understanding of domestic violence among homelessness and housing service providers. Though they were very grateful for the services providers, they felt that their situations were misunderstood or not understood or poorly understood, and they didn't feel comfortable reporting or telling about their experiences. Now here Karen talks about waking up every morning and her children asking, "Mommy, are we moving today?" Rosie, who's 27, explained that all I want is to move on, get myself well and get the kids well and, get our own place, but year-long living in emergency accommodation is not good enough. So to finish up, I just want to say something very briefly. I'm not going to make every point here about the policy context. And I've got just the housing, homelessness and domestic violence policy context. So housing policy has historically and consistently really ignored gender. We don't see within any of our housing policies reference made specifically to women's particular housing situations and their particular relationship with housing markets, which is quite distinct, and it's particularly distinct for for female-headed households. Likewise, homelessness policy in Ireland and internationally has historically ignored gender. The homelessness strategies have tended to be written for the homeless male and so on. And we know from international review of national strategic approaches to homelessness that the staircase model of service provision prevails in most countries, including Ireland, although there is evidence, positive evidence, of countries, including Ireland, moving towards a housing-led or housing-first approach. I should say, and I know that Sarah's going to speak to this later, that we do have a whole housing approach for women. In some countries, we have not moved in that direction, unfortunately, in Ireland. Also in Ireland, our women-only services are lacking, as they are in many other countries throughout Europe. In relation then to domestic violence, just in very broad brush strokes here, we do have this heavy reliance on refuge accommodation, which is increasingly seen in negative terms, that we need a range of other types of service supports for women. We might not officially have a time limit here on domestic violence refuge stays, but there is a time sensitivity attached. Women do have to navigate a complex service system in their attempts to secure both their own and their children's safety. And of course, very importantly, we've coming on stream the third national strategy on domestic, sexual and gender-based violence currently in preparation. The issue of siloed policy responses, this is a really big problem. It's one we highlight hugely in the report on family homelessness and domestic violence. We have made a range of recommendations aimed specifically at addressing this disconnect between homelessness, housing and domestic violence service sectors, which we hope can be taken up and distinct attempts made to address them. Pan-European research has consistently highlighted the need for a better coordination and integration of responses to homelessness, housing need and domestic violence. So this case is compelling for this need for coordinated, integrated approaches, because quite obviously women who leave an abusive home will need access to shelter, to housing, to health and to a range of, and host of services for their children. So I think here Annette frames it very well, possibly better than I can, when she says it's very, very difficult to get help or any support or anything because there is no communication between the people in domestic violence and the homeless services. I think everybody should start coming together and sitting down and realising that there's a serious situation. They need to come together and put things in place for people who are going through this, and just don't leave them on the side and throw them back on the streets having to fend for themselves. So I'll leave it there and thank you for listening, and I look forward to the discussion later.
Thanks very much, Paula. I think we can see the range of policy challenges and suggested solutions in the report that yourself and Fiona and Neary put together. So would really recommend people check that out if you have the opportunity. So I'd like now to introduce Sarah Kennedy. So Sarah is Communications Manager with the Housing Agency. She is the winner of the Simon Brooke Award for her essay, The Housed Homeless, the role of housing policy in supporting victims of intimate partner violence. There's a summary of her essay in the programme actually, if you want to take a look, and it's also available on the Clúid website today. So prior to her work with the Housing Agency, Sarah worked in marketing, communications and business development in the construction industry. She holds a BA in sociology and anthropology from Maynooth, a professional diploma in housing studies from the IPA, and she's currently completing a Master's in Public Policy at UCD. So as part of Sarah's prize, she actually undertook a placement with Mayo Women's Support Services, facilitated by them, but also by Safe Ireland. So thanks very much to Safe Ireland and MWSS for that. MWSS are an agency that provide a range of supports for women and children living with domestic violence. So she completed that a couple of weeks ago, and I think it was just a good opportunity to learn from each other and provide for that kind of interagency collaboration that Paula was referencing there. So Sarah is going to provide some detail on her essay and report back on her trip and why it's important. So Sarah, take it away. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Fiona. I'm really delighted to be here today and get to talk to you all about this really important topic. This is my first time speaking to a room of people in person in about 3 years, so forgive me if I might have forgotten how to speak while standing up at the same time. But I'm really, really delighted to be here today. I started thinking about the topic of domestic violence and housing, I suppose, as a result of COVID. Like many other people, I started to think about home in a very different way, and I became very conscious of how privileged and lucky I was to have a safe and secure home, especially at the time when we were hearing about the shadow pandemic that Paula mentioned, and increased reports of domestic violence. So I think that's really what prompted my interest in the topic, so I'm really delighted to get a chance to talk about it today. Before I start, I just want to say a couple of thank yous. I want to thank Clúid Housing for organising the essay prize and for picking such an important topic. And I want to thank Fiona as well for her support throughout the process. I want to thank the essay adjudicators, and a really big thank you to the Mayo Women's Support Service excuse me, and Safe Ireland, who gave me a lot of time and were very generous with their expertise throughout the process as well. So thank you very much for that. So today I'm going to cover three topics: women in housing, the Mayo Women's Support Service, my experience there, and an example of some good practice from the UK. So to begin with women in housing, I'm not going to spend too long on this today because Paula gave a really excellent and comprehensive overview. But just I do want to just emphasise and reiterate what Paula said, which is women do experience housing insecurity and homelessness differently to men. And applying a gender-neutral approach to housing doesn't capture women's experiences. And this can lead excuse me, to a variety of outcomes, one of them being the undercounting of women in homelessness, but also I think the fact that domestic violence isn't considered a housing issue is really an outcome of this gender-neutral approach to housing. This is particularly stark, I think, when you consider that the home is the most dangerous place for women, and that domestic abuse is a leading cause of homelessness. As Paula emphasised as well, domestic violence is associated with higher levels of insecurity, as women are very often the ones who are expected to leave the family home, which results in housing insecurity and also a loss of financial resources in many cases. Women's options are really, really constrained by the housing crisis at the moment, and this can prevent women from leaving very dangerous situations or from being able to leave refuges in a kind of timely manner. And this is compounded by the fact that Ireland only meets or provides 30% of the refuge beds that are required under the Istanbul Convention. Moving on then to the Mayo Women's Support Service. So as Fiona mentioned, I was very lucky to spend 2 days in Castlebar at the Mayo Women's Support Service, learning what they do, the excellent work that they do, but also the challenges that they face, which seem to be increasing. The support service was opened in 1994, and it was originally opened by the Castlebar branch of St Vincent Paul, and it's now under the governance of Safe Ireland. The women who access the Mayo Women's Support Service are primarily self-referrals, but there are also referrals from family, friends and other agencies. They carry out a really wide variety of services, but I'm going to focus on 4 main ones today. They're crisis accommodation, outreach, child support, advocacy and accompaniment. So crisis accommodation or refuge, I think, is what most people think about when they think of domestic violence services. It's the first thing that comes to mind, and it is a really, really important response to domestic abuse, and it's a key part of the service provision. However, refuge is intended and should be temporary and kind of short stay accommodation that provides safety and security during a crisis. In the refuge in Mayo, there's 5 units. 4 of them are family units and 1 is a single unit. And during 2021, that refuge housed 28 women and 42 children. And while I was there, over the course of 2 days, there was 3 requests for refuge. So it's a really, really busy service. So busy that occasionally and maybe even frequently, they do have to make use of emergency accommodation provided through the local authorities, primarily through B&Bs. So that kind of speaks to the oversubscription, I suppose, and the under-resourcing of refuge. But not all women want or can access refuge accommodation, and so it's really, really important that that outreach and support is provided in the community. The Mayo Women's Support Service provide this in multiple locations throughout Mayo. Since the start of the pandemic, they've also provided virtual and phone support, which continues. And they provide a range of supports, including safety planning, referrals to other services, emotional support, information provision, but it was summed up to me as they'll do anything and everything that a woman who is in a dangerous situation or suffering abuse needs. So really, really crucial service. They also have a full-time childcare worker, and they provide childcare for women who are using the service if they need to make appointments or things like that. So they will provide childcare. There's a playroom and a playground for the children that are living in the refuge, and that can also be accessed by children of the clients. They also run the Helping Hands programme, which was developed by Women's Aid in the north of Ireland, and it's intended to teach children who have been in the homes where domestic abuse has happened protective behaviours. So essentially, to help them identify when they do and don't feel safe, to help them to put a plan in place for how to put themselves in a more safe situation, and to identify adults who are able to assist them. So this is aimed at kids under the age of 12. The fourth service that they provide is something that I wasn't actually very familiar with until I visited Mayo, but it's kind of one of the busiest parts of the service, and this is advocacy and accompaniment. So this primarily takes the form of accompanying survivors or victims to appointments with services, with agencies, but particularly to legal appointments. The courthouse in Castlebar is about a 15-minute walk from the service centre, and the workers are kind of daily making 1 or 2 treks down to the courthouse there. Because victims have a lot of interactions with the legal system. There's court orders, access to children, maintenance issues, assault charges, which all have to be, which all go through the legal system. And the Mayo Women's Support Service, their function is to provide emotional support, really importantly to provide assistance and clarification with complicated legal terminology, which may not be familiar to the victims and survivors, to assist with documentation and to advocate on behalf of the woman if it's requested. So over the course of the 2 days, I spoke a lot with the women about the challenges that they face, and time again, the biggest challenge that they face is housing, hands down. It came through with every woman I spoke to over and over again. And one woman said to me, the housing issue makes it really hard to do my job. It's the worst it's ever been, and you're constantly hitting a brick wall. And I think, this has really dangerous outcomes. It has really, there's clear negative impact of this. Women are staying in dangerous situations, and this is the women in the service are very aware of this. Perpetrators are also very aware of the constrained housing market, and they use this housing precarity as a threat and as a means to control victims. Another issue that arose is that women have to move from the refuge into homelessness because there isn't suitable accommodation available, which is obviously re-traumatising for these people. They did talk about rent supplement, which was extended to or introduced for victims of domestic abuse over the last year, 8 to 18 months, and they said it was useful at the time, but now there are actually no properties available, so it's kind of become redundant because the market is so constrained. And to echo what Paula said, the issue around siloed services and kind of ad hoc informal arrangements came through loud and clear. It's something that is really affecting their ability to do work. For example, local authorities or even individual workers in local authorities, they may respond to a client or somebody presenting with domestic abuse differently. There aren't necessarily formal processes and procedures in place. So the women who work at the service, they have to spend a lot of their time educating service workers, building relationships so that they can inform the workers on what domestic violence looks like, and to ensure that the discretionary power that they have is used in the victim's favour. So that takes up a lot of their work, and it's something that they find is a real barrier to success, I suppose. And I think chillingly, the most chilling thing that I heard while I was there is one woman who said to me, "It's now a boiling point. It's only a matter of time before something terrible happens." And people who work in this service, they do talk about, death, and they do talk about murder. Like it is that serious. And I think that quote is just very chilling. I want to talk about 3 housing issues that arose over the course of the 2 days that I was in Mayo. The first refers to a woman who is currently living in the refuge, and she wants to move to either Cork or Dublin to undertake a training course. She has friends and a support network in Cork or Dublin, and her partner, or her ex-abusive partner, currently still remains in Mayo, so she really wants and needs to get out of Mayo. However, they're not sure if the county councils will accept somebody moving into the jurisdiction, you know, as a result, her options have become very, very limited, and she may have to stay in Mayo, or may not be able to undertake the training course. The second woman has been living in a refuge for 10 months, and she's there with her 4 young children. So the initial crisis has passed, and she is ready to leave the refuge, but despite looking for 10 months, there is no suitable accommodation in the county. But the refuge space is needed for women who are experiencing crisis themselves, so she is actually going to be discharged very shortly if she hasn't already been into homelessness. And I think that's just such an indictment of the system at the moment, that somebody would leave a refuge with 4 young children into homelessness. The final woman then is a woman who left an abusive partner and is now sharing a 1-bedroom apartment with her 4 children, while the perpetrator remains in the family home relatively unscathed. So yeah, they're just the 3 issues that emerged while I was there over the course of the 2 days. Before I finish, I want to just highlight some good practice in the UK, because I think it might provide some direction and maybe even inspiration for the housing sector in Ireland. Paula mentioned the whole housing approach, and this was introduced in 2018 by the Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance and the National Housing and Domestic Abuse Policy and Practice Group in the UK. And this is basically a framework for addressing the housing and safety needs of women in a particular area. And it aims to train housing practitioners to identify domestic abuse, to be able to intervene and to improve the housing options for survivors. So the intention is that housing providers and housing practitioners are not waiting for a crisis, we're not funneling women into homelessness, and we're providing practitioners and providers and women with the options to remain in their housing as far as is possible. The whole housing approach is made up of 12 different facets, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can see the light green on the top, they refer to different tenure types, and the ones in the dark green refer to initiatives or schemes, and they have provided kind of a chapter on each of these approaches. So if you're interested in one in particular, I would advise you to go to the whole housing approach website, but I want to just highlight 3 different schemes or initiatives here today. I've chosen these 3 different schemes because I think they're going to be of particular interest to the people in the room, but also importantly, they don't rely on refuges and they don't rely on the private rented sector, which I think is really key, because both of those options are very, very constrained at the moment, and I think providing alternative options that can still serve women is really, really important. So the first option is flexible funding, and that's exactly, I suppose, what it sounds like. It's funding that is quick and easy to access, and is designated funds that's used to support victims. It can and should be used for a wide variety of costs, and these can include anything from housing deposits, rental arrears, school uniforms for children, utility bills, and it's intended to prevent victims from returning to an abusive situation because they feel like they've no other options, to help them to achieve secure housing and to prevent homelessness. Sanctuary schemes then involve upgrading homes to improve the security features. So it's a very practical response and can include security measures such as changing or adding locks, adding CCTV, or maybe even including a sanctuary or safe room if it's required. The final initiative that I've included is managed reciprocals, and this is aimed at victims who are living in a social tenancy. And this enables victims to move from the area that they were in, but still retain their tenancy or tenancy status. And this can be done in 1 or 2 ways. The first option is, if the housing provider is large enough, they might be able to rehouse the woman in another development that they manage outside of the area. Or alternatively, if they can't do it themselves, collaboration is encouraged within housing providers, where you would work together to facilitate the move of women who have experienced abuse. I want to just draw your attention to 2 case studies that the whole housing approach has done, and this is with actual women who have used their services. They have 6 up on the website, but I'm going to just focus on these 2 today. So the first one refers to Isla, and Isla lived in private rented accommodation with her 3 children and an abusive husband, and she wants to leave, and a social care worker refers her to an advocacy service, and she saves enough money for her deposit, but she can't unfortunately afford furniture. The left-hand side in the red, I suppose, shows the path that Isla might take if there aren't any interventions or any whole housing approach in place. And on the right in the green shows what actually happened for Isla when the whole housing supports were available. So on the left-hand side, I'm unable to afford furniture. Isla can't complete the move and unfortunately stays with her husband. The abuse continues and her children are taken into care as a result. And Isla is forced to make a homeless application to the council. On the right-hand side, what actually happened was that Isla was provided with flexible funding that she could use to buy furniture. Additional security was installed in her house because she was, she wasn't feeling safe, so there was additional security provided, and her and her children continued to live independently. The whole housing approach have done these really brilliant illustrations, and they're costed as well. So you can find, I'm not going to go through these now, but you can find these illustrations on their website, and you can find how they did the cost-benefit analysis as well if you're interested. Rosa lived alone in a housing association property. In the situation where the whole housing approach isn't in operation, a housing officer visits Rosa but isn't trained to notice abuse, and so as a result, Rosa doesn't engage with any services, any domestic abuse services, or doesn't take a partner to court. And the abuse continues, and as a result, she incurs rent arrears and antisocial behaviour charges, which ultimately result in her having to leave the property, and she has to file a homelessness application. In the green then, a housing officer was trained to notice the sign of abuse, and they were able to refer Rosa to a domestic abuse service, and she took her partner to court and the partner was charged. However, she still felt insecure in her property, so they did provide additional security upgrades, and she received assistance with her debt and arrears, and a housing officer continues to check in on her, and she still lives in that property. Again, this is illustrated and costed, and you can look at that in more detail on the website. I've put the link here, and I'm happy for the slides to be shared if people are interested. So just to finish up, I just want to draw your attention to a discussion paper that was launched or released by Safe Ireland in March of last year. And it outlines our current response to domestic violence in Ireland and provides a pathway to move forward to a new integrated, holistic response to domestic violence. So I would encourage you to read that. I know Lisa from Safe Ireland is here as well, so she'll be able to speak to it. I've included some resources. I haven't been able to talk about everything today, but there are some really interesting research relating to kind of housing associations in the UK and how they train their staff to deal with domestic abuse. So I would, if you're interested, I would point you there, and I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks a million, Sarah. That was a really fascinating insight into your time in Mayo and into your essay. So thanks so much. And yeah, some really kind of practical tips and advice there, I think, for housing associations, local authorities, AHBs, and domestic violence organisations. So as I mentioned, Sarah is the winner of the Simon Brooke Award. So now is the time to officially present Sarah with the said award. And a gift voucher. So Anna is going to present Sarah with the award now. So big congratulations again to Sarah, and thanks Anna. So next up I'd like to invite Paula and Sarah back up to the table here and introduce Lisa Marmion from Safe Ireland and Aoife Flynn Kennedy of Clúid/Plan. So Lisa is Services Development Manager with Safe Ireland, the National Social Change Agency working to eradicate domestic abuse and coercive control in Ireland. Lisa previously worked with Women's Aid in Dundalk for 17 years, most recently as a services manager, and prior to that Lisa worked with Youth Work Ireland as a peer education and youth development officer. To add to that, she's currently completing a PhD on domestic violence in TCD, and then Aoife Flynn Kennedy has been head of Plan, Clúid's age-friendly housing service for over 2 years. She has over 20 years experience in the housing and disability sector across local authorities, service providers and AHBs, and her qualifications are across the areas of addiction, social policy and local government. So I've prepared a few questions for the guys, and I suppose just in terms of the first question, just before we put it out to the floor, the first question I suppose anyone could answer. So I'll leave it up to you to kind of to take it on. Now there's a mic in front of you, just in case you're wondering. It should pick you all up. Yeah. So I suppose the first question would be around the issues of domestic and intimate partner violence and housing, and how you see them intersecting. So pretty broad one, I think you've all covered it, but perhaps someone would like to take that first one up. Great. Lisa, maybe as you haven't spoken yet, work away.
Thanks very much, Fiona. Just before I launch, I just wanted to say thank you so much for inviting us. It's such a privilege to be here tonight with you, and of course speaking about something that is such a deep part of the work that we're trying to bring visibility to, and we're welcoming this change, these public discussions and opportunities, and certainly the collaborations. So, question. And what was the question?
So it's just around how do you see the issues of domestic violence and housing intersecting?
Oh, they're so deeply aligned. The experience, like as we know, the experience manifests in many ways. But like we would certainly have worked with thousands of women and children at this stage that confirm that it is for us the leading cause of family homelessness, and that journey into homelessness, that journey through housing instability, is just so connected with the whole experience. Like financial abuse, as we know, present in 99% of these cases. The way in which finances are controlled, coerced, manipulated, leaving people in positions where, they sometimes fall into rent arrears. The experience itself and how sometimes people are attached to antisocial behaviour. Like in one of the UK studies, 40% of women in that situation had that complaint of antisocial behaviour levelled at them, noise pollution. Of course, I'm sure it's no shocker about damage to property, not just as a consequence of the abuse, but as a strategy often to undermine people, to make sure that they can't sustain the house that they're in. So things where the costs are there is, things like forced entry, replacing windows, on a constant basis, and I mean that's always something to watch out for. But like again, it's there's the human cost of this, but there's also the cost to all of us in terms of like repair in that instance is about 20% of budgets for repair. That's what the research is telling us. Evictions as well, of course. I mean there are people that are, as Paula you had mentioned, about somebody sleeping in their home. That is, or not sleeping in their home, sleeping rough, sleeping in their car. I mean that is just, I'd love to say that's not common, but it's so common. So evictions, rent arrears, ASB complaints, and repairs. Like that's the way it kind of manifests.
Yeah. And I suppose on that question, I suppose for anyone in the panel, to what extent, I know it's been touched on there, but do you feel the housing crisis has impacted on women's ability to leave the home, the family home? Aoife, maybe you might want to take that up. Yeah.
I think it's had a huge impact. I think for women, when they get to the point where they can actually make a decision to leave, that's a huge point to come to. And then when you're hearing everywhere that there is no homes, that there is nowhere to rent, that there is no options, I think you're already feeling that you don't have an option, and then that's compounded by the rhetoric or the media talk around. So it makes people make decisions, and decisions maybe not to leave that safe environment, because you know your options are already limited, but they're even limited more. So I think the housing crisis is definitely having an impact on people's choices that they're making.
Would anyone else like to touch on that one?
I think just to say, when I was in Mayo, there's something they talked about a lot, and they find you know, they're feeling like they're failing the women that they're trying to serve, because when women ask them, you know, is there somewhere for me to go, like they know the answer is no, it's refuge or homelessness, and that's really difficult for people who are working in these services, and I think it's really demoralising as well. You know, these are people who've worked, you know, I met loads of women down there who've worked there for over 15 years, and they said, this is the worst it's ever been, like I just can't do my job, I can't serve these victims, and I think that's just really, really hard. So I think it's this, even for people providing the service, they're finding it really difficult.
Yeah. And just in terms of resources, what resources do you feel these families need access to that they don't have currently? If anyone wants to touch on that.
Yeah, I can just say a few things about it, maybe that didn't come up as well. Obviously housing, but there's a whole range of other kind of a spectrum of need, and then scaffolding that needs to be built. And one of the big issues for women were the lack of supports available to their children, like absolute chronic lack of supports, that they couldn't get therapies. Now we've made a range of recommendations in relation to this, but also firstly for the children, but then for themselves. What the women tended to do was to sort of put their own trauma on a back burner, which doesn't serve them well, but probably doesn't serve their children well, because their children can feel the anxiety from them. And there were women telling us in interview about the kind of anxiety, almost attacks their children would have if they were away from them for long, etc., etc. So there are a whole range of trauma-informed interventions that are needed to support women and very quickly to support children after they leave an abusive home. So I think that needs to be really put in place. So what we have recommended there is that in range of all local authority areas, that TUSLA enlist the service of private providers, and that they fund those providers in respective areas to provide the necessary therapeutic interventions, for example, for children.
Thanks very much, Paula. Maybe a question specifically for Lisa. You know, if you were talking to a housing professional, housing officer, housing manager, what are some of the signs of domestic abuse or intimate partner violence that they should look out for?
That's a very good question, Fiona. I would say like there can be patterns that you know people can present with or have history of, and some of those are those examples I gave earlier. But you see, I think the complexity of this issue is it's often hidden in plain sight. So it does take, like we find working with other agencies, it does take that opportunity to build capacity there, to build confidence. Because some of the things that put people off even asking about this issue is just not having the opportunity to get ready to do that. And sometimes fear, and I think it's very attached to the whole, you know, domestic and the history of this, and it's a private issue, but then sometimes then feel that they might make something worse or that they shouldn't intrude. And so like that's why like social change is a big part of our thing, and it is about all of us really embracing change and bringing these conversations out into the open, but setting our people up for success, regardless of, like, we all encounter people. There are people among us here, there has to be, statistically, that have lived this in childhood, that are living with it now, or have lived it in the past. So, you know, wherever we connect with people, to be feeling confident, competent, to be able to have those conversations, because women and children in this situation very rarely spontaneously disclose. So they often need that. They often need that environment created for them in which that they can, you know, speak about the horror that they're living with, that they've been told that they won't be believed anyway. You know, so let's help each other with that, is what we say.
Yeah, and is that your experience with, let's say, you know, working in housing, that those signs aren't necessarily always visible? You know, coercive control obviously is becoming much more recognised as a form of domestic abuse, which is good. Yeah, is there maybe a fear around kind of interfering in the kind of family situation, etc.? that you've come across, say, in your work?
Yeah, I think Lisa's right. I think it's so mixed. I think, you know, you'll have your very obvious damage to the property, you know, but then is the housing officer or housing staff member going to be curious enough to ask really what that's about, or are they going to just assume that it's bad management of the property? But then it can be much more subtle. And I think as housing professionals, we need to be curious and not take things on the face value, and also allow it a space of time for people to have the opportunities to maybe disclose if they're comfortable enough in a safe environment. You know, so when you look at eviction cases, it's often not just clearly that someone didn't want to pay their rent, or when you look at mismanagement of property, it wasn't that somebody just decided they weren't going to look after their property. There's always something behind that, and I think it's about having the time and the space to be a bit more curious about those things and create the right environment. And you mentioned yourself, Paula, about trauma-informed, and I suppose Clúid is on a journey now to become a trauma-informed organisation. That's really important because it gives people the confidence to have the conversations and not be inclined to think, as you said, Lisa, it's a private matter and I just won't get involved.
Yeah.
It's very complex.
Yeah, and is there anything that you think maybe local authorities and AHBs could be doing to support, you know, tenant survivors to remain in their homes?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I loved one of the recommendations that Paul made about kind of collaboratively working together, because I think in Ireland we have so many silos of services, and having to tell your story again and again and again to each provider is really, really traumatizing. So having and relying on a champion as well, hoping that someone you're going to talk to is going to be a champion, that they're not going to just do it, you know, because it's their job and they have to. So I think for agencies to be able to come together in a really structured way would be really beneficial to people, and you know, being able to move from one local authority area to the other very, very easily, or from one HB to the area, even for a short period of time while the kind of that danger zone is there, you need to just get out of the area. So I think there's a lot we can do. I think coming here today and having these conversations is just so important, and I think it's amazing to see that, because it gives you the confidence to discuss it, but we definitely have a longer journey to go.
Yeah, I suppose in terms of the policies, you know, housing for all and the forthcoming strategy on domestic violence, you know, perhaps there's scope for more inclusion of specific reference to domestic violence and intimate partner violence. So specifically then, just for Paula, and then we'll throw it out to the floor. So the issue of stigma comes out quite strongly in your report, I think, and the sense that, say, single mothers, for example, feel quite stigmatised and maybe judged by service providers. I suppose, what can we do to combat that, and where do you think it stems from?
Yeah, I think you know, service providers are working hard to help people, and but certainly with the homelessness service providers, for example, would have said repeatedly that they're increasingly dealing with the issue of domestic abuse, but they don't know how to deal with it, that they don't have the adequate training, and you see, if you don't have adequate training, you don't have the confidence. And that lack of confidence, I think, it becomes screamingly obvious to the recipient of that service. So I think that, incidentally, a good number of the homeless service providers who we spoke to in focus groups and individually, they would have undertaken some training, but it was typically a one-off injection, and that's really not enough. And some of them found that some of the training, although they valued that it was information about domestic violence, rather than what do I do when a woman makes a partial disclosure, a full disclosure, and that feeling of I don't know what to do, just don't know how. So I think really we do need training on the dynamics of domestic violence and abuse, including coercive control, but very importantly how to respond. And how to respond to a suspect, you know, if I suspect as a service provider that something is wrong here, how do I begin to investigate that with that lady, that mother, and so on. So I think training is crucial. It's not the only thing, but also, of course, greater societal acknowledgement and understanding will help women to disclose abuse in their relationships.
And perhaps it comes back to that Irish kind of mentality of, you know, leaving people to themselves and kind of not meddling, I suppose, in people's business. So yeah, I'd like to throw it out to the floor now. We have a couple of roving mics roving about there. So yeah, I'd like to invite anyone to stick their hand up if you have a question or a comment. Yeah, there's a lady there in the back.
I'm just really interested in some of the comments, but a lot of the focus seems to be on women leaving the home, and that really upsets me, because why is it the women leaving the home and not the perpetrators? And some of the policies in the state are so bad about that. Like, for instance, in 2014, the 2014 budget stopped mortgage interest supplement. So for women financially dependent on a husband, if the husband leaves the home and they're relying on social welfare, the one-parent family allowance, they are now supposed to pay a mortgage out of their, there's no support to pay a mortgage, and they ultimately end up they choose between letting him back into the home or the homelessness, and that's an unfair choice. And in the current pandemic, there was a really good opportunities, and there was a real acknowledgement of the pandemic, the shadow pandemic you were talking about of domestic violence, and there was a really positive move to provide rent supplement for people to escape from the home. But why was there not an interest in putting mortgage interest supplement to allow women to stay in the home? And then in addition to that, one of the things that really upsets me, that is, and I should say I'm part of an organisation called Spark. I am from Focus Ireland too, but I'm also Spark. So one of the issues, which is single parents acting for the rights of kids, and one of the major issues for lone parents is they've ended up as lone parents for domestic violence reasons. And again, one of the things that if they do manage to go to court and they do manage to get a domestic violence order and they do manage to get a borrowing order, which is all very difficult to do, and then the court orders a mortgage payment to be made, the state then comes and assesses that mortgage payment as if it was payment in kind and is assessed against a social welfare payment. And that has left women choosing between, do I feed my children or do I lose my home? And these are simple policies that should have been adopted in the last 10 years. And I think there is this focus in domestic violence and housing to look at how we get women out of the domestic violence situation. And we need to turn the conversation about how do we support women to stay in their home, and how do we support children to stay in their home, and why is the perpetrator the one who stays in the home, and why is it the abused person who has to leave and face homelessness? And I think there needs to be a policy shift with all of that. So I suppose it's a question and a comment. I'm looking for support for all these things.
Thanks very much. Anyone else? Yeah, David.
Thanks very much. It's been a brilliant evening, and just really good to get that overview from Paula, but also the use that you've made of those few days, Sarah, to really bring to life the issues and the problems that are underlying it. I thought I got a really good overview impression, but I actually had a similar reaction to the previous questioner about the perpetrators. And I did see on your whole system sort of map perpetrator management. I thought, I wonder what that is. I wonder how and who. And when I was thinking about the actors who the integration needs to be with, I was wondering about the Garda. I was wondering about how sensitive and understanding the Garda are to responding to these incidents, and then how will housing providers, housing managers link with the criminal justice system in terms of action against perpetrators, rather than the focus on, sort of enabling people to get out of the home. Thank you.
Yeah, if you want to take it, Sarah.
Yeah, I suppose just to say I do agree with everything that you said, and one thing that really drew me to the whole housing approach is that it is focused on not requiring women to leave the home. It's not always possible, but it's something that should be aimed towards, and I think it's really, really complicated, and the perpetrator management section is very interesting. It involves a lot of working with external services and building up those relationships, which is crucial. One thing that they do talk about, and I think this is something that's maybe applicable in the Irish case, is including domestic abuse as something that would be considered a breach of tenancy, and that makes it a lot easier to remove that person from the home. I think though a lot of this stems from the fact that in Ireland and elsewhere, we don't really talk about domestic violence, and we don't really talk about how it intersects with housing until it's at a crisis point, until you can't actually stay there, you have to leave. And that's why the main thing we think about when it comes to domestic abuse is refuges. And I think that it requires a mindset shift, that we're not waiting until somebody literally can't stay there anymore and they need to enter a refuge. So I think it requires a mindset shift. There are some practical things you can do in terms of how you phrase your tenancy agreements, particularly if you're an AHP or a local authority. But I agree, I think it's awful that that's the situation, and it just sets them up for years and years of insecurity and precarity for just trying to leave an abusive situation. I don't have the answers, but I do have the support. So, yeah, Eva?
I suppose in Clúid, in our own policy, it's exactly that, Sarah, as you mentioned. Domestic violence is classed as a breach of tenancy, and although it is quite a legal and complex issue, a conviction or a barring order in that sense will mean that we'll actually go to evict somebody's partner and support the individual to remain in the house. What I have seen from some of the cases we've dealt with is that it's that initial moment of needing to get out and get some space to clear your head, and then with the desire to go back. Because obviously your natural circle of supports are all living around you. So it's trying to find some sort of mechanism to give people that safe space to get out initially, take a breath, gather themselves, and then work on a plan to regain control of the house. But yeah, we've put that in place, and I think it's important.
Any other thoughts?
Yeah, unfortunately, whereas that exists at a local level, in Europe, it is not national policy. We are so very far from that being national policy. Our response to domestic abuse has been historically to provide an inadequate number of refuge services, which de facto mean that we require women to leave the home, and there is no other plank there. Now, I don't know if there will be in the new national strategy. I certainly hope that there will be. I did see a draft of the national strategy, and the first thing I did when I received the draft was I did a find for homelessness. There was not one reference to homelessness, no. And I did another find for housing, and there's not one. Now, that's in the draft strategy. So, this is a long-awaited strategy, a lot of discussion about the strategy, particularly on foot of the shadow pandemic discussion, the figures produced by Safe Ireland, by Women's Aid, and so on. So, but yes, unless we move away from the same kind of system that we have addressed homelessness through, the same kind of lens of providing emergency shelter, and the same kind of lens that we have addressed direct provision, the direct provision system is another example. We're going to continue. We're going to be here in 10 years' time having the same conversation, I fear.
That's why I suppose that policy part is so important, because you don't want to have to rely on a champion in a various organisation, or you don't want to have to rely on, you happen to be housed by Clúid, but if you're housed by somebody else, you're not going to have those same options. So having it as a national cross-border policy means that wherever you are in the country, or whoever your provider is, you're going to go in the same direction.
Any other questions? Yeah. Cara? Yeah.
We don't need this, I have a naturally loud voice. Thanks very much, everybody, for your contributions. I've really enjoyed listening to everyone. One of the things that strikes me, Sarah, I was just thinking when you introduced yourself, when you thought about when you were walking around during the pandemic thinking what was going on in people's houses, I was thinking exactly the same thing, especially during that first lockdown. What on earth is happening in my neighbour's house? And Lisa, you were saying part of your work is to deal with social change. I'm just wondering, is there an opportunity now where people like me, you obviously had the same thought, there must be lots of people who are having the same thoughts at the moment. What is that social change? What is that social change that needs to take place? I know Fiona said, maybe it's just an Irish culture where we don't want to get involved, but it can't just be that, right? Because we're turning away from things that are there in front of us. We're not curious about what's actually happening. I'm just wondering, what are the things that you have what you know need to change, as well as policy issues. What are the other kind of behavioural, societal changes that need to take place for this to really become something that people take seriously, if there's no mention of housing or homelessness in this national strategy? Lisa? Yeah.
Well, it was quite a lengthy list, but I think it would be, I think a great starting point is, this shift in how we view this and how we respond to it, even at a basic level, the language that we use around it. Even at a basic level, people are struggling with understanding this issue. So, just echoing what Aoife had said as well around giving people those opportunities to explore this issue at a deeper level, understand it, and change will come out of that. But there are so many things that we could change. Like our some of the things off the top of my head, we're now really realising the impact on children. I know when I started working in this area, they were really seen as bystanders. We shifted our thinking around things like that. And when we know better, we do better. We understand children in their own victimhood now. I think it's really welcome to talk about the gendered nature as well. Because again, people need their own response, tailored to their own experience, tailored to their own identity. They will experience this differently, depending on where they come at it, for many mediating factors going on. So a more sensitised approach to all of this, being trauma sensitive, gender sensitive, and certainly DV sensitive. But yeah, is that okay?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I think there's just a myriad of things to look at. Any other questions from the board? Yeah. Just given the number of the statistics that you very succinctly put together for us in relation to the numbers, I imagine that approved housing bodies and other housing providers have a very large percentage of people presenting within their own populations with these needs. So it's not just people in the private sector who have mortgages and so on. And the family structure changes, the social changes in Irish society, the marital family structures, multiple partners, and so on, and all the other issues that come with that. Mechanisms are missing, and there's the complex needs of somebody emerging from a traumatic situation who might even understand it with the 3 C's of confusion, crisis, and crisis again, and children. And when you bring all that complexity together, those mechanisms that are missing cross over multiple levels. So we have child protection, we have adult safeguarding, and the safeguarding legislation that's currently under review, guard review, for how we might actually protect adults who are vulnerable. And by definition, vulnerability is a transient thing, but under the legislation it is not. It is clearly defined as somebody whose capacity is permanently issued, but somebody who's in recovery from trauma is a transient issue. So that's something that's going to change, and if we're changing our policies now and other policies are changing, are we maybe not prepared enough to have an all-encompassing mechanism that helps us to respond to a family who are not the traditional family structure, or who have equal rights? They might have joint tenancies that prevent us then from coping, and they have equal rights. So we have to, and then you have the other complexities where you have somebody who gives a counter order. So if you go with the system of where there's an order in place and then somebody who gives a counter order and there's 2 orders on the one residence, how do you deal with that? And how do you prioritise who gets the right to stay and who should leave, and who is the perpetrator and who's not, and who's responding with an actual genuine order need, and so on. So there's so many issues, and the complexity of this hasn't even been touched into, but I know Safe Ireland have been doing incredible work on it. It's a very convoluted question, but massive issue. No, I think your last point touches on kind of what we've seen in the news over the last few days as well. It's a very complex area in that regard. So yeah, would anyone like to take that one up? Sarah, were you looking to?
I was actually looking at Lisa because I was thinking about the report or the discussion paper that Safe Ireland put together, just exactly on that, I suppose, on how the services are so siloed and the need for putting a system in place that will integrate them. Lisa will probably be better off able to speak to this than I will, but I can just echo that when I was in Mayo, this is something that they found over and over again, that people just didn't understand. First, they didn't understand what domestic abuse looked like, they didn't understand how it manifested. the result that you got depended on the person that you met on the day. It depended on how long they'd been in their job, maybe if they were having a good day or a bad day. And I think, I don't know exactly what it would look like, but like formal procedures and guidance for all services and agencies that are going to be interacting with this issue, which is basically all of them, would remove a lot of the discretion and remove a lot of the just the relationship building that's required to get services. So Lisa might be able to talk to that report, but just I think the fact that so much is left up to individuals and there isn't formal guidance in place is something that we could change.
Absolutely, Sarah. But just to echo what you have said there, and that is a critical part of when things are relationship based, and it works well. That's wonderful, and people move posts, and that's that. So again, to Paula's point around the more formal approach, the more something that we can all reach out and touch, something that we can actually refer to, rather than because where there is discretion can work both ways. We need clear and clean lines on this issue, and that in itself helps elevate the priority of this. And it helps it really become something that what gets measured gets actioned, don't we know? So just one of Paula's points from her research was at the moment we're not even counting these families. They're not appearing anywhere. So where are they? Because we know they're in refuges all over Ireland. We know they're on couches. We know they're in cars, but they're not in our figures. So these are the shifts and changes that we can do together. And we're at a point where we're talking about it, which is so very welcome. I'm fed up listening to me
Yeah, we've made a range of recommendations in relation to integration of services. But there has to be the political will there to put that in place. And incidentally, there are within local authorities there are examples of good practice, but they typically hinge on the interest and commitment of a single individual. Which means that even if that person doesn't leave, and let's assume they don't, just for a moment, but that doesn't mean that what's happening in this area of the Midlands is happening in the North Dublin or so you have this really patchy and inconsistent response. We have recommended really that the local authorities need to take the lead in convening case management approaches.
Maybe just one very quick question from Aidan there. And then we'll wrap it up.
Just not so much a question, but thanks a million, everybody. And I was just thinking the stark realities, and particularly the figures from the European Agency on Fundamental Rights, which is that big survey. But I remember years ago I was involved in Women's Aid, and everyone's talking about how complex this problem is. But this woman from Duluth in Minnesota trained us, and in that city, it was one of the cities where homicides against women was reducing, and completely against the trend in the world. And she asked every system, like every judicial system, every housing system, one question is, how safe is the woman here in your process? How safe is this woman in the judicial system when a perpetrator was arrested, or so on and so on? So it isn't a complex issue in some ways. It's how safe is a woman who's a tenant, how safe is a woman who's in our homeless service, and I suppose that's the simplicity of it, and the complex issue is the fact, and Paul's point is that none of this has been reflected. How safe is a woman at national level, where there is strategies being produced which are not mentioning housing, because how safe is the woman there out of her home? So I suppose it's fantastic to have all this work done on the national level, is where we need to see a lot of this happening. But thanks a million for a great talk.
Thanks very much, Aileen. So I'd like to invite Brian O'Gorman back up to the podium now, just to close up. And thanks so much to our panellists for your really interesting contributions there, and for the presentations. Really, really appreciate it. So thanks very much, Brian.
And I won't keep you long. I did want to thank everyone who contributed to making this evening a success.
I rock up at the end of these things and take a lot of the plaudits, but let there be no doubt about it. The credit for this event goes to Fiona and Laura and the communications team. What I will take from this evening, it's important for housing associations and to listen and try and put themselves in the shoes, in as much as they can, of survivors of domestic violence, to appreciate their experience and how we can contribute to improvements in services. Thanks to Sarah Kennedy, to Paula Mayak, Lisa Marmion and Aoife Flynn Kennedy, and congratulations again to Sarah for winning the award. And thanks to all the friends and former colleagues of Simon who initiated the idea to run this lecture last year: David Mullins, Aidan Culhane, Owen O'Sullivan, John Mark McCafferty, Niamh Randall, Mike Allen, Michelle Norris and Mary Higgins. And finally for me, I just want to say that, you know, I'm grateful to have known Simon, and I know that Clúid will always be in good hands while he continues to be imbued with the spirit and values of those such as Simon.
Just a reminder that there is wine and canapes there at the back, so we'll throw open the door now. Thanks very much.